welcome to the Light Reading Podcast. I'm Kelsey Zeiser. I'm an editor at Light Reading.
And I'm Phil Harvey. I am also an editor at Light Reading.
My name is Matt Starling. I am a senior product marketer over here at Ekahau.
Oh, you have a longer title. We need to extend ours, Phil.
It sounds better than ours, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Welcome, Matt. Thanks for being on the podcast.
No, my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be on today.
Yeah, we're very curious about Ekahau and all the things you're up to there. To start off, maybe you could tell us a bit about yourself and your role at Ekahau, and then for those that aren't familiar, maybe just a 2-second overview of Ekahau as a company.
Of course. So my role at Ekahau really is to promote our products. I do a lot of webinars and speaking at conferences to tell people about all of the latest and greatest things about Ekahau. I actually come from a very technical background, so I spent my whole career working in Wi-Fi, doing lots of surveys, lots of designs, lots of installations, and then somehow I kind of tripped and fell and landed in marketing over here at Ekahau. And if you've not heard of Ekahau before, we are a company that provides solutions for you to be able to design a great Wi-Fi network, validate it with our measurement tool called the Psychic 2, and keep it really high performing and optimized by using some of our software applications that you can run on either your Windows laptop, on your Mac laptop, on your iPhone, your Android, or by leveraging some of the power of the cloud in our browser-based applications as well.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks. And tell us a little bit about who you're kind of marketing to. Are you selling to service providers directly, or are you mostly targeting enterprise IT departments?
Both, to be honest. So a lot of our users can be a mix of network owners that are doing this in-house themselves. We like to make our products easy for anybody to be able to use, so anyone can pick up our device, take it for a walk, and then find out what's going on in their space around Wi-Fi and then implement some changes. But also we have a lot of service providers that buy our tools and then sell their professional services using our products to be able to go and design for maybe a really complex environment like stadiums or warehouses or even large enterprise office spaces as well.
Oh, that's good. So you guys, I would assume then you have some kind of channel relationship set up then, and in those instances, is it the traditional IT channel or are the service providers themselves? Are you selling through them in any way?
So we are a channel business, so things
Okay.
do go through distribution and through to our resellers as well.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Uh, so Wi-Fi 6 gigahertz or Wi-Fi 6E, as it's more um, commonly known. Um, I want to get into a little bit about how that helps enterprises. What's the differentiator between that and all other flavors of Wi-Fi, and then also what the adoption has been like, because you guys seem like you would be um, on the front end of knowing that, given that you're helping people design networks.
Yeah, sure. So maybe if I give a very brief history of Wi-Fi to kind of from where we were a few years ago to where we are today. So
Mm.
Wi-Fi was kind of born or started around early 2000s or very late 90s. And we operated in two frequency bands. So we worked in the 2.4 gigahertz frequency band and the 5 gigahertz frequency band. And then there's different standards or generations of Wi-Fi, and they all have their kind of nuances and things that they can do and they're capable of. For instance, let's say going back all the way to one of the first generations around 802.11b, which actually came out in 1999. This operated solely in just 2.4 gigahertz and offered speeds of up to 11 megabits per second, which isn't too fast. And then if we forward on a little bit, we let's say around maybe 2009 was when we got quite a big change in this Wi-Fi space with one of the new standards that was called 802.11n. And this is actually, we mentioned it earlier about Wi-Fi 6. The first time we actually go back and rename or apply a different naming convention to, let's say, 802.11n is actually for this one where we start using Wi-Fi 4. So the Wi-Fi Alliance thought that it was maybe becoming a little bit complex for consumers to understand the different generations of Wi-Fi and what their capabilities were. So that's where they actually introduced things like Wi-Fi 4 and Wi-Fi 5 and Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 6E, and now Wi-Fi 7 being available. But the key thing I wanted to just point out here is that the different frequency bands, they had their pros and they had their cons. 2.4 gigahertz is actually a very limited amount of spectrum that we have access to. In total, it's around like 80 megahertz, depending on where you are in the world. So wherever you're listening or watching us today, the rules and the access to the frequency bands and channel that you have might be slightly different to what we can do over here in the UK, or for Kelsey or Phil over in the US. So 2.4, very limited amount of spectrum, and also a lot of IoT devices or non-Wi-Fi devices were operating in this frequency band. So think of like microwave ovens or Bluetooth and other like wireless technologies. A lot of these devices, they operate in the 2.4 gigahertz frequency band. So pretty quickly, this band became kind of unusable or really unreliable for corporate business critical connectivity. The 5 gigahertz band, however, depending on where you are in the world, you actually get up to 500 megahertz of spectrum, and that would equate to roughly around what we would call 25 non-overlapping Wi-Fi channels, which is great. That's a whole bunch more than what we had in 2.4 gigahertz with 80 megahertz potential. Yeah, 80 megahertz worth of bandwidth and three or four non-overlapping channels, depending on where you are in the world. But again, with 5 gigahertz, with so many Wi-Fi client devices now and access points and networks out there, the congestion was just getting a little bit too much, and we really were crying out for some additional spectrum. And back in 2021 is when we finally got access to another chunk of the spectrum, which is 6 gigahertz. And the 6 gigahertz spectrum really offers us being able to deliver business critical Wi-Fi reliably, because there's such a huge amount of additional spectrum that we can use, and a whole bunch of other benefits that I'm sure we're going to dive into in a few moments' time.
That's a good overview. Thanks for that. Yeah, in fact, if you're thinking about it from a, I guess, from a U.S. centric point of view, you'll kind of know right about the time 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi became popular, because that's when the Roku devices and all the TV streamers really started catching on. Like there was like I don't remember exactly what year it was, probably 2018 or so. But it's like they all just hit the market at the same time, and they were all like way better than the experience we had had before, because that used to be a wired only experience. So it kind of unlocked things there. And then as these things go, we used it for a while and everything was great. But like you're saying, in the enterprise space, especially, then um, now we've got so many devices on it. Now we're kind of hitting a wall again. And fortunately, right around the corner there is not only more unlicensed spectrum for us to use. Thank you, FCC. But
Mhm.
also, and all the other regulatory agencies. But then there's also, new devices and new, methods to kind of connect to that. Um, on the on the 6 gigahertz thing, I wanted to point out, if you measure the world of technology like I do in iPhone upgrades, then
That's fair.
Wi-Fi 6E is going to be your iPhone 15 Pro and newer. So that's, and Apple is kind of a laggard usually on these, on these things. They were one of the last to get 5G, in their phones and stuff like that. But yeah, so start with the iPhone 15 Pro and forward, and those are all of your Wi-Fi 6E or Wi-Fi 6 gigahertz devices.
Yeah,
I'm
I
gonna
have
go
to
head out
admit,
to upgrade now because I got the 14.
that is
See,
definitely a good reason to upgrade, Kelsey, and I'm totally in the same boat as Phil. I do measure things in the Apple world, because I do drink from the Kool-Aid. I'm a bit of an Apple fanboy. Everything I use is all Apple
yeah.
based. So, yeah,
Yeah.
when the announcement for iPhone 15 Pro is that it's 6 gigahertz, I ordered it straight away.
You're like, oh, okay, it's a thing now.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is gonna last at least, a few months. So that's
Yeah.
good.
Exactly, and the a few key benefits of 6 gigahertz is that if we are talking from in a US perspective, is you actually get up to 1.2 gigahertz of additional spectrum to use. So for context, in 5 gigahertz, it was 500 megahertz and up to 25 non-overlapping channels. In 6 gigahertz, that's 1.2 gigahertz and up to 59 non-overlapping Wi-Fi channels that we can potentially use for our enterprise networks, which is just fantastic because it does really mean that we can deliver business critical, reliable Wi-Fi networks. A couple other things around 6 gigahertz as well is not only the additional spectrum that we get access to, is there's no requirement for backwards compatibility. So the oldest Wi-Fi standard that we support in 6 gigahertz is 802.11ax or Wi-Fi 6E. And when I speak to a lot of people, I know there's a bit of confusion around Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6E. Wi-Fi 6 effectively is the same technology, so 802.11ax. Wi-Fi 6 operates in the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz frequency bands. And then Wi-Fi 6E is 11ax, but in the 6 gigahertz frequency band. So I know that's a little bit confusing with Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6E. I was actually speaking to a customer very recently the other day and said, "Oh, yeah, we've got these brand new 6 gigahertz access points. I've got these Wi-Fi 6 client devices, but I can't seem to get them to connect to 6 gigahertz." And it was unfortunate that their client devices weren't actually 6 gigahertz capable. They were Wi-Fi 6, so not Wi-Fi
Uh,
6E.
yeah,
Yeah,
so
so that was
there's a backward compatibility issue after a certain point. And that's, I guess that's to be expected too, though. Once you kind of jump technology generations, if um, part of the efficiency and the um, I guess cost savings of being able to go higher technology at lower or the same prices is you've got to make that decision. How far back do we support, everything else, and is the power trade off and the chips, the space we use on the circuit board and all that stuff, is that really worth it to keep it going?
exactly that. And a couple of other benefits around the 6 gigahertz frequency band is if you move your enterprise networks into adopting the 6 gigahertz frequency band, you are forced into actually having improved security. So the strongest method of authentication and encryption, WPA3, is actually mandatory in 6 gigahertz, whereas it's not in the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. So you could still use WPA or WPA2 and not use things such as protected management frames or management frame protection, depending on how you like to refer to that. So actually moving to 6 gigahertz, you get additional spectrum, cleaner spectrum, and improved security. So again, just going on that, being able to deliver more reliable business critical Wi-Fi networks, shifting to 6 gigahertz, and also then the newer standard Wi-Fi as well, like Wi-Fi 7, which has been actually going back to Apple as our benchmarking for this. The latest
Right.
iPhone 16s, they actually do support Wi-Fi 7, so they will work across all frequency bands 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz, and they support Wi-Fi 7. And Wi-Fi 7 again offers at a high level, effectively being able to go a bit faster, a bit more efficient over Wi-Fi to be able to deliver those business critical Wi-Fi networks.
Yeah.
And I'm not
I ha
trying to sell iPhones, but if you do,
Yeah.
that is always the benefit of the latest iPhone, is it should be able to connect to darn near anything.
Yeah.
So that's anyway,
Yeah,
go
my
ahead,
husband
Kelsey.
just upgraded to the 16, and now that we're talking, I'm like, maybe I have some good,
Yeah,
fodder for an argument for me to upgrade as well."
that's right. I mean, how can you be talking about these things and not experiencing them?
I know, exactly. Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, and also,
We'll do,
why aren't
like,
we
a group
covering
call with him.
something more fun like, cars or boats?
Yeah.
Mhm.
I love it. Um, Matt, you were talking a little bit about, working with the customer and kind of explaining some of the differences between Wi-Fi 6 and 6E. What are some of the challenges, common challenges you face with when you're talking with customers or enterprises about Wi-Fi 6 adoption and, how do you work with them through that, I guess?
That's a great question, and one of the things that we can really do here at Ekahau is help you or your listeners or anybody really when it comes to planning to upgrade for 6 gigahertz or Wi-Fi 7. Um, I used to do before I joined Ekahau, I used to do a lot of professional services, so designing and delivering Wi-Fi networks. And whenever I would be having that kind of initial conversation with a customer for one of the sites that we was going to deploy, if they had a Wi-Fi network, let's say from 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, they were at that kind of natural life cycle point to upgrade to some newer access points, and they've got some new requirements for the Wi-Fi network, how they want it to be delivered for their end users. As we go through that initial conversation, they would say, "Hey, Matt, we've seen that there's these brand new Wi-Fi 7 access points that have just come out from vendor X. Can we just take down our existing access points in their same locations using the same cables and then put up these brand new shiny 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi 7 access points? And it's going to solve all of my Wi-Fi issues, and we're going to have no connectivity problems, and everyone's going to have a fantastic time on Wi-Fi." And always the answer would be maybe. There's a lot of
Depends.
factors here that
Sure.
we would need to yeah, there's a lot of things that play into that where it might work, but it might not work. And what we can actually do with Ekahau now, if you take what we call our hardware device, which is the Psychic 2, which scans everything in Wi-Fi, and also because it has a spectrum analyzer inside of it, it scans anything that's non-Wi-Fi across 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz. If you let's say I came over to the US and surveyed your office, and you've got old 2.4 and 5 gigahertz network, I just survey with Ekahau and the Psychic 2. Once I finish walking around your space, I can upload that data to our cloud, and we have something that's called Ekahau AI Pro Online. And what we can then do based off the measured survey data, we can take a look at the network. We can actually simulate changing from those access points, those old 2.4 and 5 access points, to whichever vendor Wi-Fi 7, 6 gigahertz capable access point, or any access point you want in those same positions, and then see, is this network going to be able to be performing well, keeping the existing locations, or do we need to make some slight changes, like maybe add some additional access points, or relocate a few APs potentially as well? And the other thing that when we talk about like challenges with the customers is actually the Wi-Fi 7 access points. That the biggest thing I think maybe that gets overlooked actually is around the cabling. And I know a lot of the reasons why customers want to keep the same locations is to try and save costs with the cabling, because that can be actually way more expensive than even buying the access points, like running new cables.
Sure.
The newer access points like Wi-Fi 7 and even the Wi-Fi 6E 6 gigahertz access points, they actually require quite a lot of power. So most of them will actually need PoE++ to be fully operational. So the thing that I find that gets overlooked quite a lot is like, how long ago did you run those cables, and what generation of cabling do you have in your environment? Because if these APs require um, PoE++, if you don't have Cat 7 cabling, you're not even going to be able to power the APs into full function mode. And so maybe you lose some of the radios, maybe the USB ports don't get powered on. So you might have to run new cables anyway just to be able to power them, and then factoring in things like, have you got enough PoE budget for your switches, and thinking about the rest of your network. So we can help people with planning all of that side using the Ekahau tools, and taking a look at potential locations for um, access points, and making sure you've got the sufficient coverage, and watching out for any interferers and things like that you might have.
It's a sobering thought for a enterprise, IT person when they realize that to take advantage of the new technology, they're going to have to go all the way through the shop and redo the cabling.
Yeah.
'Cause- I mean, because honestly, is I don't know how common Cat 7 is, but I mean, I would assume not that common yet. I mean, because most I just saw a brand new wired home the other day, and it was still like 5E or 6 or something like that. So it's
Very
you know,
common, right? I mean,
yeah,
most I think most enterprises, if it's not a really new building or a site, probably have Cat 5 or Cat 6 cabling. So
yeah,
you could have potential, just up to the PoE plus, which may be okay for some of the access points and be able to provide
yeah.
turn them on, but you might just lose. It might not power on all of the radios, or they go into like a low power mode where there's not everything's fully functional. So it's just something else to think about when it comes to that upgrade. Is not just the actual access points, but making sure the rest of your network is going to be able to handle that. And at some point, there's always going to be a bottleneck because if
Mhm.
you look at some of those marketed data rates for Wi-Fi 7 being able to achieve up to 40 gigs data rate over the air, well, you know, do you have 40 gig to each switch port to the AP and then through your firewall and your ISP and stuff like that? So it's just planning for the whole entire network is really important when it comes to upgrading.
I want to revisit the legacy devices issue again because there are there some things that 6E can do or does to help improve the performance of legacy devices, assuming that everything can connect.
Yeah, the biggest benefit 6 gigahertz has for legacy devices is actually the more devices that we get, let's say from iPhone 15 onwards, or there's obviously loads of Androids and Macs and iPads and Windows and et cetera, that support 6 gigahertz. The more of these newer devices that our consumers and users bring into our networks that actually move on to the 6 gigahertz frequency band. If you imagine Wi-Fi as a motorway and you have almost kind of three lanes that you can drive down. Most of the client devices, they could only drive along two lanes, 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, and that's become very, very congested. Now we've got access to that 6 gigahertz lane. The more devices that come along and actually go into that 6 gigahertz lane will actually create less congestion and more space for these older devices in the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz lanes. And if I give you an example of some of these typical devices that maybe just can't be upgraded to 6 gigahertz, because you might be thinking, Matt, well, why don't people just buy brand new 6 gigahertz capable devices? There are so many client devices out there, especially in the medical industry, medical client devices that work in 2.4 or 5 gigahertz, warehouses, scanners, lots of machinery out there that'd be very expensive, and maybe the chipsets are not even there in 6 gigahertz yet, that they just cannot be upgraded. So the benefit for legacy devices is the more 6 gigahertz ones that come along and go into that new lane, it just creates more space for when you're driving along in your older cars or bikes or whatever it is you drive along in those lanes, and there's more space for you to be able to go there.
Yeah, I that's a great point. I'm glad you mentioned the medical profession too, because I was going to say medical and government are the two biggest industries I can think of that like when they get a networking scenario working, they lock it down and they leave it alone and they just do their jobs. And if you want proof of that, of course, I would say go to any hospital. Some hospitals are more modern than others, but like, especially in my dentist office, up until a couple of years ago, he was still running all of his x ray scans and everything on a machine that ran Windows XP because he set it up, it worked. It was just doing the one job in the corner, hooked up to one machine, and it didn't need to be internet connected. So it was just, chugging along. And I used to give him garbage about it, but I mean that's really how the whole industry kind of has that mentality when it comes to networking. So yeah, I think that's an interesting thing for folks to consider is like if you get to a point where you are upgrading, but you want to leave all those devices alone, you might actually help them out because you're offering the newer devices a chance to kind of connect over 6 gigahertz and leave those other bands alone. So those devices can't be bothered.
Yeah. I went to that reminds me, I went to a dermatologist once, and they were still using a dot matrix printer, and I was like, I think I need a little bit more advanced here."
That's fun.
Yeah. I was like, "Interesting." Yeah, so Matt, just to, maybe wrap up, if we could talk a little bit about Wi-Fi 7 and, when is that, necessary to implement, if, 6E is working well and optimized, when should you move over to Wi-Fi 7?
So my honest opinion, if you've deployed a Wi-Fi 6E 6 gigahertz network, I probably wouldn't upgrade to Wi-Fi 7. There isn't a big enough compelling reason to go from Wi-Fi 6E to Wi-Fi 7. However, if you've not yet upgraded and you've got a 2.4 and a 5 gigahertz network, then I totally would upgrade to a Wi-Fi 7 capable network that supports the 6 gigahertz frequency band. And the I would say the four main things that's kind of new with Wi-Fi 7 is there's a technology that's been implemented, something that's called a multi-link operation. Um, at a high level, basically, what that means is when you have a Wi-Fi 7 access point and a Wi-Fi 7 client device, when it uses this technology called MLO, there's a few ways that it can operate. First way that I'll talk about is actually what it can do. The access point when it communicates to the client device and vice versa is typically what happens when you have, let's say, a non-Wi-Fi 7 device, like a Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 5 device, is that if my client device connects on 5 gigahertz on a particular channel, when it communicates, they just stay on that channel and they just transmit their data. What's new with Wi-Fi 7 and the multi-link operation is that actually the access point can send traffic out of the 5 and the 6 gigahertz radio to aggregate that data and transmit it to a client device, and also vice versa as well. So it means that we'll be able to kind of communicate out of two radios on different frequency bands at the same time to communicate between our client devices and access points, which is not something that we've been able to have access to before. And the kind of other way that this technology will operate is, rather than doing like aggregation, it'd be more around, if there it'd be link steering. So if we're communicating on the 5 gigahertz frequency band and the access point determines that, oh, actually there's quite a bit of interference here, we should move to 6 gigahertz because it's going to be cleaner, or vice versa, then it can just steer over to 6 gigahertz instead. So effectively, that's going to make for lower latency and improved efficiency when we have Wi-Fi 7 client devices and access points making use of this new technology. The other thing that Wi-Fi 7 brings is something called 4K QAM modulation, which basically just means we can send our data faster over the air. So that's how we're going to achieve faster speeds with more complex modulations for encoding the data. We can also have up to 320 megahertz wide channels with Wi-Fi 7, and that's where you see those marketed data rates of up to 40 plus gigabits per second. I
Right.
would throw a big caveat into the ring here: is you're probably never going to see this,
Sure.
because this would require, if you're going to use a 320 megahertz wide channel, maybe at home you would do this, but in the enterprise space, especially in the US, that would actually take you down to having like 3 available channels. So you're going to have lots of congestion if you do this.
Mhm.
And to achieve that 40 gigabits of data rate, you're going to need to have lots of spatial streams. And typically, our client devices, your iPhones, your iPads, your tablets, Windows, Mac laptops, they have 2 spatial streams. So I think realistically, there's 2 channel widths. I can imagine there being a big adoption for with Wi-Fi in the future. Is like 20 megahertz wide for 2.4 and 5 gigahertz still, and then 80 megahertz wide in 6 gigahertz. And a typical Wi-Fi 7 device speed, using that most complex modulation on a 20 megahertz wide channel, would actually be, with 2 spatial streams, would be 344 megabits per second. And if you're using an 80 megahertz wide channel, it'd be 1,441 megabits per second. So it is pretty fast, that you'll be able to achieve. And I think that's the most kind of like realistic data rates that you're probably going to see for Wi-Fi 7 devices. And then the last thing that I'll just mention that's new with Wi-Fi 7 that's coming is something called spectrum puncturing. And why I think this is what probably excites me the most with Wi-Fi 7 is that if we have a access point that's communicating to a client device on, let's say, an 80 megahertz wide channel, and it detects that there's maybe a bit of interference on 10 megahertz of that channel, rather than backing off and then not using that channel anymore, it will basically just ignore and not use that part of the spectrum that's got that interference and communicate around it. So as that's again moving into that improved efficiency and part of what's so cool about Wi-Fi 7 and moving into, especially with the 6 gigahertz frequency band, I think combining Wi-Fi 7 and 6 gigahertz, you're going to get faster, faster speeds, lower latency, improved efficiency, and ultimately be able to deliver more business critical, reliable Wi-Fi networks.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's a good overview, and thanks for kind of tying it all together because I think that helps folks kind of get the idea of like what where we are in the technology um, journey, but also what the finer details are between like staying where you're at and the upgrade, and that gives give people a second to decide whether they need to go that extra step or whether they're fine where they are.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Matt, thanks so much for your time. Look forward to having you on again in the future.
Thank you
Thanks, Matt.
so much for having me, Kelsey and Phil. It was a total blast, and hopefully everybody watching or listening along enjoyed it and learned something new about Wi-Fi today.